The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying that it's known what Chazal tell us in regards to Noach, that he did not daven for the people of his generation, not like Moshe Rabbeinu that did daven for those that had made the Egel. In regards to this, we find a machloikas in the Zohar, this is, between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yehuda says that the fact that Noach did not daven as Moshe did was not actually some sort of shortcoming in Noach, but rather because Moshe Rabbeinu himself, when he davened, was relying on not on his own merits, on his own schus, but rather on schus avos, on the merit of our avos. Whereas Noach obviously couldn't rely in his tefillah on the merit of the avos. On the other hand, Rabbi Yitzchak is of the opinion that nevertheless Noach should have davened and try to arouse Hashem's compassion on the people. Says the Rebbe that my father, meaning the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, explains the reason and the difference of opinion between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak. The reason why Rabbi Yehuda is the one that is trying to find the schus, the merit for Noach. On the other hand, Rabbi Yitzchak seems to be looking for his choiv, almost like his guilt, is because each one of them was speaking in accordance to his own personal level. That is, generally, Rabbi Yehuda is on the level of chesed. And that's why he was trying to find the schus, to speak positively about Noach, going according to his own midah, Rabbi Yehuda's own midah, which is the midah of chesed. On the other hand, Rabbi Yitzchak, who was more from the level of gevura, that's why he was finding the guilt of Noach according to his midah, that is Rabbi Yitzchak's midah, the midah of gevura. So the Rebbe says, l'cha'ira, we need to have explanation. We know that there's a command in the Torah, Pirkei Avos tells us, Ve'avei donas kol adam l'kav schus, we need to be judging every single person favorably. And obviously this is a rule for every single yid, even for a person who's more in the mode of gevura, even a person whose characteristic is gevura. So how can we understand that Rabbi Yitzchak is almost looking to find the guilt or the negativity about Noach and not judging him favorably as the Mishnah rules? Says the Rebbe, similar to these two opinions of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak in regards to whether Noach should have been davening, could have been davening for his generation, we find another machloikas on the pasuk in the beginning of our parsha. On the words Noach ish tzaddik, that Noach was a tzaddik, and then the pasuk concludes b'doirosav, in his generation. So we find that Yeshmer Rabbi Seinu, some of the Chachamim, learned this in a way of praise, that is, that he was a tzaddik in this generation of terrible people. How much more so if he would have been in a generation of tzaddikim, he would have been even a greater tzaddik. And some again take it more in a negative way. That is, that according to his generation, he was considered a tzaddik. Relative to his generation, he was considered a tzaddik. But if he would have been in the generation of Avraham, he wouldn't be considered as anything at all. He would be completely insignificant. So here too, is the same question, very similar to the same idea, same question. Since we have a choice, we could learn it in a way that's a praise for Noach. We could learn it in a way that's a disgrace for Noach. Why would we say that the Torah would intend to try to bring out something negative about Noach? Furthermore, we have a rule that even negatively about a non-kosher animal, something not nice, the Torah doesn't speak. The Torah won't use a derogatory term even regarding a behemoth, an animal. How much more so? Definitely the Torah wouldn't want to be speaking about the disgrace of Noach. So how could there be an opinion to say that the Torah is adding a word in our pasuk, b'doirosav, just to bring out something negative about Noach? Says the Rebbe, we could explain this all, but by first prefacing that we explained already in another place, in other sichas, the Rebbe explains that this rule, that the Torah won't use a lashon meguna, a language of disgrace about something, is only when it comes to when Torah is trying to tell us a story, an episode, etc. Whereas when Torah is coming to teach us a halacha and a din, a straight out halacha, then the Torah will always use a very, very clear language, even if, because of this, we're not going to use the most beautiful, beautiful expressions and language. Because a halacha has to be set out clearly. It has to be a clear ha'irah. It can't be ambiguous. Because we want to make sure that there's no room for any mistakes when we're going to carry out this halacha practically. Says the Rebbe the same thing we can apply over here. The fact that Torah is saying and adding the word b'doyroisov, which according to one opinion is coming to bring out a negative about Noach. The reason for that would be because if Torah is not going to bring out this shortcoming of Noach, there would be room for making a mistake in regarding something practical. What the Rebbe calls a halacha in regards to practical conduct. That is, we do find certain aspects in Noach's behavior which show that his tzidkus, his righteousness, was not b'shleimus, was not 100% complete. So in the Sicha itself, the Rebbe does not give examples, but the Rebbe does make a few references in the footnotes. And just to mention one of the references that the Rebbe speaks about over here is that we find this even in Rashi, which speaks about that Noach's emunah in Hashem, and that the Mabul was going to come, wasn't complete, and he didn't go into the Teva until he was actually, the water, so to speak, pushed him in. But back to our Sicha. So Noach's tzidkus, we find in certain ways, was not 100%. If Torah would just describe Noach as an absolute complete tzaddik, and not telling us at the same time that it's b'doyroisim, that it's only relative to his generation, we would be able to then think that these kind of conducts that we find by Noach is the way a proper, complete tzaddik acts. And therefore the Torah has to bring out something that's the opposite of praise about Noach, just to be able to have the clear guidance of what is the appropriate way of how we need to behave ourselves, and not to learn this, in other words, from Noach, those negative things. Says the Rebbe, according to this, we could take this a step even more than a step further. That the point of Yesh Darish Moisel Gnai, the point of some Chachamim learning this in a negative way, is not to come and tell us that there was something actually wrong and a shortcoming by Noach himself. Rather, it's only for what we're supposed to learn from it. In other words, to make sure that we don't learn from these shortcomings or mistakes. When we learn about Noach, we shouldn't take that in a way that we can learn something that something that's less than perfect is okay. Because the Rebbe says, we could say that when we say Yesh Der Shemoyse L'Shvach, V'Yesh Der Shemoyse L'Gnai, that some learn this pasuk in a praiseworthy way, and some learn it in a negative way, is not an actual machloikas at the practical and actual level of what kind of great tzaddik Noach was. Rather, we could say, each one is bringing out a different point, but there's no actual machloikas in what happened. In other words, like this. They all agree that on the level of Noach's tzidkus, about Noach wouldn't necessarily be something the same in the generation of Avraham as he is now. But on the other hand, everyone also holds that it's not Noach's fault that he's not such a great tzaddik as Avraham. Rather, it's becoming because of the lowliness, the coarseness of his generation. And therefore, yes, if he would have been in a generation of tzaddikim, he would have been a greater tzaddik. So what is the machloikas? The machloikas is, what is the Torah trying to bring out with the word b'deiraisov? One opinion says, Torah is trying to give him praise. The Torah is coming to speak about how great Noach is, that even in his generation, look what kind of great tzaddik he is. The second mandomer is coming to tell us that the Torah is coming to make sure that we don't make any mistakes. In other words, when we want to learn from Noach, we should make sure that we understand that that's not yet the perfect level of a proper tzaddik. And that's what it means, v'yesh darish moise l'gnai. In other words, as far as Noach himself is concerned, there was no shortcoming, there was no problem himself, because he was in a generation that he wasn't really able to be on that same level of a tzaddik like Avraham. But the Torah must bring out that this darga of tzidkus is not the ultimate yet, And on the contrary, that this is considered a negative or a disgrace compared to Avraham, he would be considered like nothing, so that the Hayra, the lesson that we take from Noach should be clear. Says the Rebbe, in the same way we could explain the two opinions of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak in regards to the fact that Noach didn't daven for his generation. Again, we could say that each one is bringing out a different point, but that there's no machloikas. That is, even Rabbi Yitzchak would agree that the fact that Noach did not daven for his generation was because in that situation he wasn't able to daven for them, because he couldn't rely on the schus avos like Moshe did. And therefore it's not really a shortcoming in Noach. Rather, what's Rabbi Yitzchak coming to tell us by saying that nevertheless he should have davened? In other words, Rabbi Yitzchak is coming not to bring out something negative about Noach, but he wants again to make sure that we don't make a similar mistake. Chas v'sholom in a later generation. Think that there's no problem that you're not davening for your generation. And that's why Rabbi Yitzchak says we must darshan. In other words, we must bring out of the story that this matter itself, this attitude itself, is a negative thing. Even though for Noach, he couldn't have acted in a different way. Because we do have to act in every single possible way to daven for another Yid, to arouse Hashem's compassion for another Yid. And that's why Rabbi Yitzchak's opinion is not in contradiction to the concept of judging everyone favorably, because even Rabbi Yitzchak wasn't judging Noach negatively, chas v'sholom. He's just wanting to make sure that we don't take anything negative out of it. And says that on the contrary, if we're not going to make sure, if we're not going to caution from such a way of conduct generally, of, in other words, saying that there's a problem of not asking rachamim for the people of generation, and to say that that's wrong, then that itself could now impact negatively Noach. In other words, saying that his conduct caused chas v'sholom this stumbling block by another Yid that's going to learn from him. And therefore, this itself is part of the schus for Noach. In other words, Noach wants, that we should emphasize that the right way is that we do have to daven for our generation. And Noach would even want that we should say that it's almost like as if it's a shortcoming of Noach himself, as would be the simple understanding of Rabbi Yitzchak's word, that Rabbi Yitzchak said that Noach should have davened for them. In other words, to ensure that chas v'sholom there's no something similar to this coming out by another Yid in future generations. And through this itself, we're making sure that the conduct of Noach is not in a negative way. In other words, not missing any shleimus. In other words, by us making sure not to learn from that itself ensures that Noach remains pure and nothing negative about him. And therefore, we act in future generations that we do daven for other people, for all the people of generation. And when we do that, that itself, so to speak, fixes up the fact what Noach practically wasn't able to do. So again, even though in his generation he was not able to carry this out because in his generation that was not possible, as we said, he didn't have the schus avos, etc. But nevertheless, if it's as a result of him that we bring out that what he did was not the perfect thing, and yet we act in a way when we do daven for other people, when we take this generation to daven for the people of generation, and that through that itself we're being shleimus to Noach himself. Says the Rebbe, here we have a hoira practically to our days. The Rebbe says it sometimes happens that a person is doing whatever he thinks is according to his ability to influence his environment, anshe doire, the people of his generation, but for reasons that are seemingly completely not dependent on him, he's not being successful. And he might make the calculation by saying, Anias nafshi yitzalti, I did my bit, I saved myself. Not only in regards to my own avoid am I doing perfectly, I also did whatever I can to work with other people. But I wasn't able to accomplish it. It's not my problem. Comes along Rabbi Yitzchak and gives us this hayra, that it is really possible that you did as much as you can. And it's not only your imagination, but even according to Shulchan Aruch, Torah Semes, you really, really did everything perfectly. Nevertheless, we need to know that you cannot remain there. You cannot be happy with the situation, satisfied with the situation. Rather, we have to keep on, so to speak, announcing and calling out, like what was said about Noach, that nevertheless he should have davened for them. In other words, to recognize that this idea of not asking rachamim for the generation is a negative. But that itself causes, as we said, that from there itself it turns around to become a matzav of a schus, that the Eibishter is mevatel, gets rid of the reasons and the causes for all the negativity, and gives the Yid the opportunity to ask rachamim for the people of his generation, and to ultimately achieve that they should do tshuva. Especially, says the Rebbe, in our time in Ikvus of the Mashiach, that the Rambam paskened already in the Sefer of Halachos, that the Torah promised, the Torah guaranteed. That Soif Yisrael last is tshuva, the end will be the Yidden will do tshuva, the end of their galus, umiyad hey negalan, and immediately they'll be redeemed.